Composition is, for the most part, the art of proportion. If our vision wasn't contextual, this would be the same no matter what we did. But we add a companion, and suddenly it's a little bit different, but mostly the same. Then we add a third, and we look at it again. Then something around it. Now further, what if the thing around it was different still? How would it change? Yeah, maybe it's a landscape now? What do you think? Buildings, trees, I don't know. To people? Proportion is so important because the same object, the same size, in a different context could look like a telephone pole or like a cabinet drawer handle. If you take nothing else away from this, I hope this makes you very conscious of the frame around the objects in your image and how those relate together and the natural notan that develops between the two. Now, just looking at what Wikipedia has as the rules of thumb for composition. 1. Divide your work into thirds. Keep the number of subjects to odd numbers. Simplify. Create a center of flow and a directional flow, but somehow avoid bisecting the center of the picture. Use contrast. Put the most prominent subject off center and have the horizontal line not divide the center of work into two parts. And if you're thinking this has very little to do with how you decide to put on your shoes or arrange your house and you're giving a collective I'm not surprised. It's not that these rules don't work. They do. The problem is the way they fall apart if you're using non-standard sizes, and also the way they seem to expect that we want our pictures to be like Pygmalions and come alive. Your eyes do a lot of calculating. And by the time you hit kindergarten, your eyes have figured out something that you may or may not ever figure out consciously in your life. That between all living things, there's a shared set of mathematically proportional relationships, and that dead things just don't have that. And further, that when you make an object that's close to those proportions, it feels somehow like it's slightly alive. The underlying assumption of almost all those suggestions for composition is that you do want your compositions to be alive. You do want them to be like sunflowers and not like rather dead parliament buildings. So what are those proportions and how can we use them? As it turns out, living things, whether it's humans or sunflowers or amoebas or even our DNA, seem to use the same proportion, a very simple one that you see here. A plus B is to A as A is to B. And without thinking about the math very much, why would this simple little proportion work? Well, I think it's because it exhibits how things grow. And how do living things grow? They start out a single cell, and they divide in two, and that process continues. And that works whether or not you're a dolphin, or a cactus, or a human, or a wallaby. As you start to look at different places that talk about the divine proportion, you always see the nautilus shell. When we make squares that exhibit the same proportion, A plus B is A as A is to B, then what happens as we stack them? They become a spiral, and that spiral is perfectly mimicked in the shape of a nautilus shell. Rotate that spiral, and you get the form of a sunflower, or a cactus, or a cauliflower. But that shape isn't just on the outside. That beautiful spiral isn't just a decorative exterior shape. It's intrinsic in how things branch and grow. We humans, too, start out as a single cell that divides in two and then into four. Just like with the nautilus shell and with the cauliflower, our growth spirals out in a great journey from our origins to our final form. And it's not surprising that the divine proportion or golden ratio finds its fullest realization in the human form. It is the ideal of growth, but not always the reality. In our body-obsessed world, it may be that you come across the divine proportion or the golden ratio for the first time in a dentist's office or a plastic surgeon's consulting room. Is it any wonder that we want our artworks to be like ourselves? I've spent most of my adult life puzzling over this very simple little proportion. But the key is it's a proportion. It's not an absolute. And sometimes I wonder if the surgeons realize that, or the fashion mavens. It's the relationship of the parts to the whole. And I hope, as you've been watching this video, you notice that the whole is, in point of fact, the video itself, the entire screen. And while each part has exhibited those divine proportions, have they exhibited in their relationships to each other? And I invite you, as our assignment this week, to find the real relationships and puzzle with me and how we can create gold. Not gold bullion, golden relationships. Proportions between the individual elements of content and the actual video codex itself. But most of all, to create golden relationships of growth and harmony between each other.